Last week, Junior Church and friends did an outstanding job of something we call the Nativity. It's a story of the birth of a man called Jesus of Nazareth. And there's a few characters in that story, and they were all there last week, like the shepherds and the wise men. However, it's not clear that the wise men and the shepherds ever actually met. There are 4 books in this collection of books that we call the Bible that tell us about Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And only 2 of those mention his birth. One's called Luke and one's called Matthew, and they're actually quite different. A lot the same, but some big differences. One of them has no shepherds in the story, and one of them has no wise men in the story. Today we're looking at Matthew's version. Matthew tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem during the time of somebody called King Herod. And that's interesting because that would put Jesus' birth sometime between 40 BC and 4 BC, because that's more or less the most likely time that people think that Herod died. Wait, how could Jesus of Nazareth be born before 4 BC? Because BC means before Christ. That's how the years are measured. So how could Jesus be born before Christ? Well, that's thanks to a man called Dionysius Exiguus. Well, it's probably not just his fault. Dionysius was one of the scholars who started this tradition of dating things by Jesus' birth. And this didn't happen until around about the 6th century. And Dionysius and his friends made a mistake. Most historians would now estimate that Jesus of Nazareth was probably born round about 6 or between 6 and 4 BC. Try and get your head around that. So Matthew's first character in his story is King Herod. Now we know a bit about Herod. He was known as Herod the Great. He was allowed by the Roman Empire of the time to be king of Judah. He is around about 40 BC that he became king. He was, and he wasn't, a Jew. So he was descended from someone called Esau, who was Jacob's brother in the story, and that means that technically Herod was descended from Abraham, and so he was kind of Jewish. But the promises in the story and the blessings from Abraham, from Abraham's God, go to Jacob and not to Esau's line. Herod was what was called an Edomite. Now, Herod wanted to be the king, and he wanted to be king of the Jews. And the Romans knew that he would do a good job. Well, for them, he would do what he was told, he would raise them lots of taxes, and he would behave himself. So Herod called himself a Jew, and the Romans allowed him to be the king. Herod, however, didn't bother practicing any of the Jewish ways, following the Jewish Torah, their way, their law. He did rebuild the Jewish temple, but then again he also built a lot of palaces, some for himself, but other big monuments as well, to Rome. He was a huge fan of Rome and the empire. And it was built on money raised from the Jewish people and through the Jewish system, most of which was going to Rome, that he built these things. He could claim to have brought a kind of a peace and an order to their land. But it was actually only the same kind of peace and order as the empire. In other words, peace through power, peace through violence, peace through exploiting the people and controlling. The only real people who got rich or benefited from Herod's rule were Herod's family and the Roman machine. Herod was also infamous for other things, sadly. In his later years, he became very sick and particularly paranoid. He had multiple wives, at least 10, and he became frantic and worried that one of the many children he had was going to try and take his throne. So he had, we know at least one of his wives he had murdered and at least 2 of his sons. He also knew that with the people, the Jewish people, he was deeply unpopular. And so in fact, he put orders in place that if he was to die, on the day of his death, hundreds of popular Jewish leaders were to actually be arrested beforehand and kept in prison. And then on that day that he died, they were to be executed as well. So that regardless of the fact no one cared about him, there would be crying, lots and lots of crying throughout the Israel on the day of Herod's death. Thankfully, we're told that the wife he had when he died decided not to carry out these orders, so they never actually happened. Matthew's next characters, if you like, are the Magi from the east. Magi was a word used in the time for people with an interest in a few different things: astrology, dreams, prophecies, books, sometimes magic, which is where we even get the word magic from. These particular men were from the east, we're told. Could be Persia, could be Babylon. Now, there was still a Jewish community in Babylon after the exile, and it's obvious from this story that these men were really familiar with the Jewish scriptures. They were also known as sages, full of knowledge, or wise men, as we call them. Sadly, there's actually no references in the Bible to them being kings. They did have to be rich, though, to have travelled all that way. For example, if they came from Babylon, it's about 900 miles. And to bring such expensive gifts as well, they would have had to travel with a big group of servants and people to support them as well. Matthew is inspired. He's an artist, like so much of the writers who are inspired to write down these stories. And like in any Jewish story, there are layers to how Matthew is telling this account of Jesus' birth. One of the prophecies of his story, of his Jewish scriptures, of Jesus' scriptures, is about another wise man, a non-Jew called Balaam. And in Numbers, he speaks of a star that's going to rise from Jacob's line, from Abraham's line, from Jacob's line. Now, Balaam was a wise man from the east who came and spoke truth about Israel's God, despite being an outsider. We're meant to get the echoes in Matthew's story to make these connections. Herod and the wise men are kind of the main characters, but they're not the only characters, because there's also the chief priests and the teachers of the law that Herod goes to ask questions. It was their job to run the temple, to run the system of sacrifices, to supposedly help people connect with the Jewish God. It was their job to teach the Jewish way, the Torah, their scriptures. They were actually made up at the time largely by people who were benefiting from Herod, from the system, who were happy with how things were going. They didn't really want the boat rocked. They enjoyed their position. And they were happy with Herod and the way that things were going. So when Herod asks them when the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the one that had been promised in their scriptures, was supposed to be born according to their stories, they respond, quite rightly, with Bethlehem, because that's where the prophets like Micah, for example, had said. Herod sees this as a massive threat. And as Matthew tells us this, he's inspired, we've said. He puts before us characters. He sets up Herod the Great, powerful, paranoid, ruthless, clever, and also unbeatable, part of the Roman Empire. Then there's the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They know their story. They know the right things to say. They know the prophecies. They know where the Messiah is supposed to come from. But what do these characters in Matthew's story see? I said that Matthew doesn't have any shepherds in his story. Except he kind of does. See, he mentions King David. King David started his life famously as a shepherd. The quote that the chief priests give, which is actually a mixture of from Samuel and from Micah, talks about a new king who will be like David, who will be a ruler and of course a shepherd for his people. And Matthew includes that for a reason. Herod I think he wants us to see, was in no way a king, a real ruler for his people. And neither were the Romans. Fake king, fake empire. The chief priests were not being shepherds for their people either. They were too worried about themselves, keeping things the way they were. They only saw this new baby as a threat to the way things were, to their own comfort. This kind of thing happens in these stories all the time, and that's why it rings true, because the other characters are the ones who see. The characters who should have known better, the king of the Jews and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, miss the reality. Herod and the chief priests should know better, but they're blind basically. And yet the outsiders, the wise men, the magi, who don't come with any fixed ideas of what this God should do, or how the situation should be, or what kind of person this God should send, they're the ones who find and who see Jesus. Matthew lays it on really thick. If you read through this, it tells us that Magi see a star. And then again, later, in a few verses later, they see the star and they're filled with joy. And then finally they saw the child. And they're the ones who respond by recognizing who he is. By seeing a king and responding how you respond to a king, with worship, by kneeling and by bringing the most expensive things you have to give. Things that will actually in this story be really handy for a family who have to escape to Egypt and somehow survive in that land. Herod and the empire are the ones with power, but they couldn't fight it. The chief priests and the teachers of the law are the ones with the knowledge, who should have known better, but they didn't get it. The wise men, the outsiders, who didn't have any agendas, who didn't have a script, they're the ones who saw, who recognized, and then who responded the only way they knew how, as they saw how this would change everything. It's like Matthew's asking, how are you going to respond? Like Herod? Like the chief priests and the teachers of the law? Or like the wise men?